Okay, we are recording. I am Brandon Polite, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, and I'm joined by Cheryl Frazier, who's a postdoctoral teaching fellow in philosophy at Auburn University in Auburn, Alabama. Cheryl, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. Well, we're talking about your paper, Toward a Responsible Artistic Agency, Mindful Representation of Fat Communities in Popular Media, which just came out, or is it out or is it coming out?
It is officially online, not assigned to an issue yet, but it's
Okay,
on the
so
way.
so it'll be out this year, 2024, in the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism. And in the paper, you develop what you refer to in the title as responsible artistic agency. And you're talking about fat communities in particular, right? How fat people are depicted in film, television, and so forth. And so, can you just briefly talk us through this basic idea of what responsible artistic agency is, and then we'll go from there.
Absolutely. Yeah. I just want to start by noting that throughout the conversation, we're going to be using this term fat as a value neutral way of describing people in a larger body size. And this follows up on a sort of long tradition in a academic field called fat studies, as well as from activist work in trying to reclaim this term fat. I think most of us are really used to hearing fat used as an insult, or as some kind of sign that someone has failed and that their body is in need of change, that they need to lose weight. And for various reasons, fat people have argued that this is really harmful. It reinforces negative stereotypes and misconceptions about fatness and fat people's value and their relationship to health. And so, because of that, fat people have both in sort of academic settings and just in the sort of real world have tried to reclaim this term fat and to use it in a neutral way, just as we would say that someone is tall or short or blonde or brunette. So with that in mind, the paper that we're talking about today is about this idea of what I call responsible artistic agency. So we are really used to watching, television and film all the time. I think a lot of us, when you get home from a long day at work, you throw on Netflix, or you throw on a YouTube video, and you watch these characters, and they can subtly influence how we think about people in real life. So, for example, when I watch This Is Us, I might see these characters that are navigating difficult family dynamics and mental illness. And I take those sort of messages that I see to be indicative of what it's like to live that kind of life, to have, two twin siblings, or to live with depression and to try to cope with that. And this is great. It can help us build sort of compassion for one another. It can expose you to experiences you've never had. But it also runs the risk of sort of reinforcing stereotypes or falsehoods about what it's like to live a certain kind of life. And we see this happen especially with fat communities, where fat people um, are often depicted as being lazy or incompetent, or in need of sort of saving because they are fat. And this happens a lot in art. We can think back to even like very basic childhood stuff like Ursula, who is this massive fat sea witch in The Little Mermaid, who, is seen as evil, and that evil is related to her body size directly. And so, for artists that are concerned about these narratives that keep being reinforced, and who may want to help improve the way that we see the relevant community, in this case, fat communities, I think that they can use this framework of responsible artistic agency to improve their artwork and to help sort of disrupt this cycle of harm that real people are being exposed to through the art that we create and consume. So the general idea with responsible artistic agency, is that artists, when they create a work of art, especially that engages with or represents marginalized communities, need to think really carefully about the extent to which they include fat people in the product or the relevant marginalized community in the production of their artwork. And they need to think about the narrative web that exists surrounding that community. So they need to think about the pre-existing artworks about fatness in this case and reflect on how the narrative they are creating reinforces these harmful attitudes that are already out there, or maybe pushes back on those and helps to humanize the relevant community.
Awesome. And so what you're talking about relates to my previous interview, which was with someone you know, uh, Jeremy Freed, and his notion of ally aesthetics. And so, how does what you're doing here with this notion of responsible artistic agency relate to what Jeremy's doing with this notion of ally aesthetics? How is it similar, but how is it also distinct?
Great. Yeah, so Jeremy, with his account of ally aesthetics, says that artists can use their art and their relationship to marginalized communities to help advocate for those communities. And so he takes this notion, this sort of general notion of being an ally to communities of which you are not a member, um, and so, you need to have some kind of uptake from those relevant communities, and you need to have an understanding of their needs and experiences, and be championing, sorry, words are hard, for those communities in the art that you create. And I think this is a really important project, but it's also a pretty robust commitment. Ally aesthetics involves having a really deep and sort of extensive understanding of the community that you are trying to support. And it also involves having uptake from that group, having them say, we deem you an ally. And I think that's one of the important elements of Jeremy's project is he says we really shouldn't be self-identified as allies. We should look to the relevant communities. They want to give us the sort of stamp of approval as an ally. And so I take this to be a much more robust project and sort of lifelong commitment that you're really putting in the work to learn about the community and the struggles that they face and their history, and then trying to help motivate their need or represent their needs in your art. But not everyone's going to be able to take on that project. And people are going to be on like at different places in their journey of maybe aspiring to be an ally towards a relevant community. And so, what I was looking for when I started to develop this account of responsible artistic agency is something that could help us fill our time, still consider our moral obligations as artists in that interim, where we're not quite at the point of truly being an ally yet, but we still have all of these moral obligations to be mindful of the way that our work impacts other people. And there's a scholar, Katerina Karola, who has this great book, The Weight of Images, where she talks about how when we think about movies and television, we often think about these really passively as just like the stuff we enjoy to get our mind off of work or our kids or, our nagging friend or, whatever frustrations we have in life. But actually, movies and TV really shape who we see as being worthy of attention and care in society. They show us what kinds of people exist out in the world and tell us something about why we should value them. And so I think there's a lot of sort of weight on the decisions we make when we create these artworks. And responsible artistic agency is designed to like give artists a framework for thinking more carefully about those decisions so that they don't replicate pre-existing harms against various communities, even if they're not fully to that point of really robust allyship with them.
Yeah, so to be an ally is a much thicker, richer, robust, long-term form of engagement versus responsible artistic agency is more like don't be a jerk, be
Right.
thoughtful, uh, don't like try not to promote stereotypes, negative stereotypes or prejudice that have little basis in reality, right? And it's just sort of to be mindful of how you depict certain types of people in whatever type of media you're uh, doing it in.
Yeah. And part of the goal for this sort of framework is to just be better than we've been before. So obviously, I don't want to set the bar at being perfect, at never having any flaws in the representations that you make, because if we were worrying about that, like, one, we're going to have way less art to consume because people are going to be spending a lifetime trying to perfect it. But also, like, we're setting artists up for this unachievable goal. Like, communities disagree about how they want to be represented and about what is a good or bad representation, as we'll see with the case of Fat Thor that we'll talk about in a bit. And so I don't want to say they have to get it perfect, but there are various things that artists can be doing to improve on the mistakes that we've had in the past. And so in the sort of end of the project, I talk about this case of American Pie Girls Rules, which is like the newest in the American Pie franchise. And these are these like raunchy sex comedies told from the perspective of teenagers that are just starting to explore their sexuality. And historically, like, this franchise was really only told from the male perspective. The characters that were at the center of the story, whose pleasure and sexual lives were considered, were the men in the story. And women were really an afterthought. They were sort of the butt of all the jokes, but their pleasure and their needs and their agency as people wasn't considered in the sort of genre or in this catalog of films. And so in the last film in the franchise, Girls Rules, the artist decided, like, we can't continue this sort of misogynistic trope of only caring about men in a conversation about sex. We need to think about what women want and need also, because they are relevant agents in this activity of having sex. And so they made a small change to have the protagonists be women who were allowed to sort of have this rich, engaging sex life, and to desire sex not just for the sake of male pleasure. And the movie isn't perfect. Like, it's still this sort of low budget raunchy sex comedy. They still didn't have any women on the writing staff. So there are things they could continue to work on in the future. But I take it to be a really good example of responsible artistic agency because they're trying to do better than they did before.
Yeah, they're trying to course correct in a sense, right? That
Right.
the franchise up until that point had centered the male characters and their agency and sexual pleasure versus the women who are by and large, as you said, the butt of jokes. Um uh and so yeah, there's that issue. And there's also, just historically, and this is something you discuss in the paper, that fat characters in film and television like were often in supporting roles and they were the butt of jokes, right? That their fatness was a source of humor, and they're sort of flattened out as sort of two-dimensional, one-dimensional characters as opposed to the more three-dimensional protagonists who are, the main character who we're supposed to empathize or sympathize with and care about versus fat characters, right? And so it's interesting then to sort of shift from the APCU, the American Pie Cinematic Universe, to the MCU with the example of Fat Thor, which you touched on a minute ago, and which is a main example in your article, right? Where his fatness is very much the butt of jokes in that film, right? That every
Yeah.
character is taking shots at him for
Yeah, he's got
having
cheese
gained
whiz
all
running
this weight.
through his veins.
I'm sorry, what?
One of the characters jokes that he has cheese whiz running through his veins. Yeah, I mean, he's very much the on the receiving end of explicit, like, anti-fat jokes from his fellow cast members, but also with one of the sort of decisions of the filmmakers that I talk about is that they choose to visually make fun of the fatness as well. It's not just in, like, the narrative or the story, but in the sort of filming decisions. Like, they zoom in on Thor's fat body, his stomach, the first time that it's revealed what he looks like after the snap, this big sort of world changing event. And the filmmakers pause. There's no dialogue, there's no additional action for a few seconds, knowing that the audience is going to laugh, whether because it's, oh, how funny a fat body, or just out of some kind of discomfort. And so they're sort of relying on these anti-fat attitudes to make a joke about the body, not just on behalf of one of the characters, but using the sort of filmography as well.
Yeah, and despite those issues, you sort of find the use of the characters positive in other respects. And so can you talk about the positive aspects of the character in that movie known as Fat Thor, right? Sort of within
Yeah.
popular discourse.
Yeah, so Fat Thor when he came out was a pretty groundbreaking character within the genre of superhero films. Historically, when we think of a superhero, we think of this super chiseled, muscular, toned body. And we don't have a lot of examples throughout comic book history of very fat characters, of fat superheroes. And so Fat Thor is groundbreaking even just on that, right? In that he is a hero that is fat. We have plenty of examples of like Kingpin, say in like the MCU, who are fat villains, but we have very few examples of fat heroes. So that is already, I take it to be like one sort of marker of success in this responsible artistic agency framework. We've got a fat hero. And importantly, he doesn't lose weight over time. He stays fat the whole time. Like even throughout this sort of show-stopping battle, he wins as a fat person. And Thor is known for having this hammer that he can summon because he is worthy. And there's this really touching scene in the film where he has been down on himself because of his weight gain, and because of the trauma that he has ensued, and feeling like he caused his friends to die previously in the films that came before this. And he summons his hammer and he's able to pick it up, which is a sign that he is still worthy even when he's fat. So I think that, as far as the message goes there, this really explicit message about his value as a fat superhero, that the film is really doing something strong. And a lot of fat audience members reacted to the film when it came out by saying, like, oh, I love this. Like, I finally feel like I am seen, and this is the first time there's a character that looks like me on screen. So I think, yeah, the Fat Thor case is a really sort of mixed bag. We've got these anti-fat jokes that are sort of undermining some of those good messages. But at the end of the day, Thor is still given the room to be fat, to stay fat, and to have value despite being a fat body.
Yeah, and one thing you point out, right, as you've already said, is that in the film he stays fat throughout. There's no like workout montage where he loses a bunch of weight and then thereby sort of signaling that he's sort of come out of this depressive funk that he's understandably been in for taking himself as being responsible for not killing Thanos and thereby leading to half the universe's population being killed, right? And thereby signaling he's out of the funk and therefore worthy to wield the hammer and to be a hero once again instead of a uh, you know guy who drinks all the time and plays video games with his loser friends. Um, right? We don't have that in the film, and that's positive. And yet, in the film where Thor appears next, in Thor: Love and Thunder, it begins with a training montage where Fat Thor becomes Jacked Thor once again. And you sort of mentioned this in the paper, sort of prompted by an anonymous reviewer, a very kind and thoughtful anonymous reviewer who will remain no, okay, he won't remain anonymous. It was me. The question of, does Thor Love and Thunder, by making him thin and muscular and sort of stereotypically attractive, undermine the message of Endgame in any way?
Yeah.
Like retrospectively, sort of undo all of the good stuff to the extent that the previous one did good stuff.
Yeah, and I don't want to say that it undoes all of that good stuff necessarily. Like it was still a revolutionary moment in this genre of film that we don't have a lot of other examples of. We don't have many fat superheroes, if any. We have some sort of mixed moral valence characters, like in like the Deadpool movies. There's like one fat teenager who, you know, his morality is a little more in question. Um, but beyond that, we don't have a lot of examples of truly fat superheroes. So this is still doing something that's really important. It's still great that they acknowledged that a fat character could still have worth even while being fat, that that doesn't undermine their value as a human being. But it does call into question some of the sort of aims of the creators in choosing to undo this. You know, I think part of what I want to encourage artists to do using this framework is to reflect on why they feel the need to share the narratives that they have, and to make the decisions with how the character is constructed that they've made. And you know, obviously Thor is going to undergo some sort of emotional changes from Avengers Endgame to Thor Love and Thunder. But the question is like, why did Thor need to lose weight in that case? Why did we need this workout montage other than because that's what we expect? Because we think of superheroes as needing to be thin. And so the sort of frustration is like this idea of being a responsible artistic agent is this ongoing process. It's something where you constantly need to be evaluating your new artworks within this bigger narrative web. And with Fat Thor, or with, I guess, newly thin Thor in Thor Love and Thunder, the artists need to think about like what led to that decision. Why did they decide that he had to lose weight again? Was this a narrative that had to happen? And, you know, from my perspective, it could have been a much more interesting film if they'd just decided Thor's just going to be fat now. This is going to be a casual thing we don't make a big deal out of, but he is going to be heavier. And the question, you know, the question the author or the artists have to ask themselves is like, why did we decide not to go with that? Why did we insist on this weight loss narrative? So I think that while it doesn't take away completely from the success that they had with Avengers Endgame, that it does call into question their general commitment to this project of being responsible artistic agents, of really taking care with how they're depicting these communities.
Yeah, right. And so Love and Thunder has a different filmmaker than
Right.
Endgame, right? It's the Russo brothers in Endgame versus Taika Waititi in Thor: Love and Thunder. But I mean, there is the question because it's part of the same cinematic universe, overseen by Marvel and Paul Feig, or Feig. I honestly don't know how to say his last name. Um, you know, it's sort of a company-wide or corporate-wide decision to have this character undergo this transformation and to sort of be the Thor we used to know and the Thor that we sort of expect him to be.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I think it's really messy when particularly when we think about comics, because known and loved characters are constantly being reinvented by new creators. They're getting different runs. And so I think looking at that broader narrative web is helpful in these contexts to think about like what stories have been told with Thor, the character, already, and can we do something new and something that is more helpful and supportive to these communities than what has been done in the past. And in this case, you know, Taika Waititi had the chance to do that and opted out of doing that, decided to lean back into these narratives that we've already seen. And so you know, yeah, obviously I don't want to say that like his failures undermine the success of the Russo brothers in the previous film. But there is this sort of notion that like you're contributing to this ongoing narrative about what it's like in this case to be a superhero and to have value as a superhero. And that we have to be really critical of the choices we make and the narratives we're choosing to construct within um, those artworks, looking at it sort of big picture. It's not just about your one movie, but it's about the broader sort of universe in which that movie exists.
Yeah, right. And as you were talking, I was reminded of the fact that nearly every villain in the Bond franchise has some sort of facial disfigurement. And despite the fact that like they've been criticized for that fact for well over a decade, right? In the
Yeah,
last couple iterations of, the Daniel Craig, like Rami Malek and Javier Bardem, their villains both have facial disfigurements, or the trope in the 90s of, and it may probably into the 2000s of, if a film has a trans character, she's probably a murderer.
yeah,
Right. And so, anyone that's making use of that now, right? Like, in the 90s, it's we could criticize it in the 90s, having to do with transphobia and panic around trans identity. But now, like anyone doing that can be criticized even more heavily. And I think, the Bond franchise can be criticized even more heavily for continuing this negative stereotype of people with facial disfigurements as somehow being necessarily or inherently evil.
yeah. Yeah, and I think that artists have to like understandably like look for these shortcuts so that they can easily convey this is the evil person, this is the bad guy that we need to worry about. But there's this really long and troubling history of using marginalized groups as that shorthand, that visual signifier of evil. And that's why this narrative web is concerning in the first place, why I keep emphasizing that we have to think about it is when you do it one time, maybe it's not the biggest deal to have one fat villain or one visually disabled villain. But when you do it over and over and over again, suddenly that just becomes part of the association. And we see this like not just being used in television and film, but like political cartoons too. You use the fat body to show evil and greed so that in 2 seconds, your viewer can look at your political cartoon and get the message when you're giving like a cartoon about like the evils of US's like capitalist greed, and you do that by showing the US in the cartoon as this like larger than life fat body. And so I think that sort of starts, the more it happens, the more it develops these connections in our sort of collective imagining about these people, that there is in fact something bad or evil about being fat or about being disabled or about being trans. And so we really want to disrupt that because it has concrete harms for those members of the relevant communities when those associations have been built and reinforced time and time again.
Yeah, right. And if you have a comedy and there's a fat character, they are the sidekick necessarily. That
Yeah.
they're going to be the butt of jokes, they're going to be the source of jokes, but they're a sidekick. Like, so many roles that like Rebel Wilson played, where she
Yeah.
is just there to be fat and funny and make fun of her own fatness and allow others to make fun of her fatness.
Yeah, and I think this is really interesting, especially when we think about what we talked about, like within like the American Pie franchise of this notion of desirability. So we look at Fat Amy from the Pitch Perfect movies, and the whole shtick is that she is hypersexual, that she's constantly trying to come on to men, and even women throughout the films. But it's it's a joke. It's never like a serious sexual desire or agency, but it's always being used to sort of poke fun at the mere notion of fat people being desirable and being lovable and being sexual people. And so yeah, I think that that's like one of the sort of dominant, really concerning narratives. Also, like fat people being when they are like the protagonist, just incompetent in some way or stupid. So like Homer Simpson is the sort of hallmark of this, where he's nobody's sidekick, but he also is like not a full adult human. Like he can't take care of his kids, he can't do his job, he can't love his wife, he can't raise a family. And a lot of that is associated to his fatness. And the moments when throughout the series, Homer Simpson loses weight, he's suddenly a better partner and a better father and a better employee. So there really is this like troubling history of leaning into those really narrow, limited tropes about what fat people can be. And the goal with this sort of framework is to show that fat people can be so much more than that, that we don't have to rely on these limited, harmful tropes that we've seen in the past.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. And to go back to Thor for a minute, right? That one, how did Chris Hemsworth get fat for that role? He didn't gain weight. It's a fat suit. And, a lot of actors have been criticized for their use of fat suits in various films. And that's a case where with Thor, in Endgame, you find that less problematic than other cases. And so could you talk us through why I can't say his name. Chris Hemsworth's use of a fat suit is less problematic or unproblematic in a way that other cases are problematic.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that we have to remember like this character of Thor played by Hemsworth was really well established. Like he had played this character in several movies prior to Avengers Endgame. And so people came to know him as this character, and to associate his acting and his mannerisms and his comedic timing with the character that is Thor. And so I think in that case where you already have an established actor playing this role and you choose to introduce a weight gain narrative, that lends some legitimacy to using a fat suit in that context. But that doesn't mean you just get like full rights to do it just because this character is established. So artists have to think about whether they need to, use a fat suit versus hiring a fat actor. In this case, since it is an established character, it would be kind of odd to suddenly replace Hemsworth just for this final film. So I think, they can safely rule out hiring a fat actor instead. But then is this narrative essential? Do we really need to tell this story that involves weight gain such that the fat suit is necessary? Or are there other options? Do we have to rely on prosthetics, or could we use like ask the actor themselves to gain weight? And so I think that the creative team has a lot of options on the table in terms of what they can do when they want to tell a story about a fat character. Now, in the case of Fat Thor, asking Hemsworth to gain weight for the role, um, I argue in the paper, has some sort of moral qualms to it. There are studies that have shown that having a significant fluctuation in your body weight can lead to increased cardiovascular risk. And so we don't want to put the actor in harm's way just for this one sort of film where they're going to be gaining weight really quickly and then losing it again after the movie. Especially since we know Hemsworth like went on to be in Thor: Love and Thunder, another instantiation where he was thinner. So the like asking him to gain weight doesn't seem like a great option here. It's going to ask him to undergo this sort of potential harm to his body and his long-term health just for the sake of a movie. So I think this is one of like the sort of best case scenarios in terms of justifying using a fat suit. I think they had some noble aims in wanting to include this weight gain narrative that showed a wide variety of natural responses to grief. Often people gain weight when they're grieving. So I think they were doing something reasonable in including that narrative in the first place. And that given all of those sort of factors of consideration, this was like the most responsible choice that they could make, is to use a fat suit in this case. But that's not always the case. So with the show This Is Us, for example, the one of the main characters, Toby Damon, who's played by Chris Sullivan, sort of famously ended up wearing a fat suit. And it was such a well constructed fat suit that people didn't realize he was wearing it until several seasons into the show. And there, the character wasn't established. They could have just hired a fat actor, but the creative team decided they wanted Chris Sullivan to play the character. They were the most moved by his performance. And so they would rather go with having him wear a fat suit than hiring a fat person. And I think in those cases, we have to think really carefully about the opportunities we're taking away from like real fat people when we don't have this justification of the sort of pre-existing character in this role or actor in that role to sort of justify it.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of directions we can go here. I think the probably clear one from what you just said is cases where a thin actor is hired to play a fat part, and there's sort of two options when that happens. I mean, apart from why not just hire a fat actor for that position, but if you're trying to hire a marquee name, a star who's going to draw an audience, probably Christian Bale may be the best example of this. And of course, he's the bad guy in Thor Love and Thunder, so there's that connection as well, right? Where he's sort of thin and gaunt versus in Batman, where he's overly jacked versus, in Vice, where he's hired to play Dick Cheney and he gains a lot of weight for that role. And so he's an actor, like so many actors, who take a part and then gain a lot of weight for it. And what are your thoughts on those cases where actors to play a particular role gain a whole lot of weight? But it, I mean, it's problematic, surely.
Yeah.
And so, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that artists have to be really careful about thinking about why they're asking this of actors, and why they're willing to put them through that kind of substantive body change, especially given we know that the sort of dramatic harms that fluctuating in body weight can cause. And sometimes, it's an actor's just own desires. They, want to have this dramatic change to show they're in control of their body and that they take their craft seriously and that they're really committed to their sort of art form. And so I don't want to undermine like their agency by saying they can't gain weight for a role, they can't lose weight for a role. We see this all the time that people get jacked for the superhero films or for the action film. But I do think we have to be really careful about why we're asking people to do that and how we are asking them to do that. One of the biggest concerns with these sort of instances of dramatic weight gain, and even like dramatic weight loss, is that actors are usually not doing it in a particularly healthy manner. So you hear like these sort of shocking horror stories all the time about like actors who will eat nothing but like a melted pint of ice cream every day for weeks on end so that they can get like the highest fat, highest calorie food in them so they can gain weight really quickly for a role. And putting your body through that much stress isn't just good for you in the long run for your health and overall well-being. Not to mention like all of the mental toll that having that kind of dramatic and regular change in your body can take. Because when your body changes from being thin to being fat or vice versa, it changes how other people in the world treat you and just your sort of lived experience navigating the world in your body. And so if artists are going to ask characters or actors, I should say, to gain or lose weight in these sort of significant amounts for a role, they need to have a damn good reason to do that. But they also need to try to encourage people to do that as healthily as possible, to give them the resources, like routine medical checkups and dietary support, and mental health support, so that they can do this as safely as possible. Because at the end of the day, like the sort of ethical obligations of the artist when they are committed to this kind of project of responsible artistic agency don't just end with the narratives they're telling. They also have to think about the real people they're interacting with and using to construct these narratives.
Yeah, and on that, right, there's all this concern with actors who gain a lot of weight for a role and the health complications or issues that may result from that or likely result from that. Whereas we seem culturally less concerned with all of the health complications that come from an actor getting totally jacked for a role, right? Where an actor has 6 months during which they need to put on 30 to 40 pounds of muscle, right? Which there's almost no way to do that safely, right?
Yeah.
And further, there's almost no way to do that without the use of steroids or human growth hormone, right? Even if they're not doing that, which I think most actors probably are and are lying about it. But even if they're not doing that, that's just not healthy. The only way to do that is to do no cardio, right? And you're just gaining a lot of weight. You're consuming 5,000 calories a day, working out probably twice a day, 3 times a day, 2 hours at a time, right? All of that has to be hugely negative, harmful to your cardiovascular system in a way that just gaining a lot of weight by drinking a gallon of ice cream a day would be harmful to your cardiovascular system and other parts of your body. And whereas, when an actor gets jacked for a role, we applaud them, right? When an actor uh, gets fat for a role, they may get an Academy Award for it. Just like if they lose a lot of weight, they may get an Academy Award for it. But we're like, okay, good for you. You gained a lot of weight for that role, but it's no like, yeah, right. It has to do with, body standards and so forth, right? I don't know. I'm rambling now. So what are your thoughts on like the health complications for getting ripped or shredded or jacked or whatever? Positive. Those are all positive words, I guess.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we have to, like you sort of highlighted, remember that we respond to that action very differently than we do responding to someone getting super fat for a role. And we want to be, I think we ought to be critical of that kind of attitude. And to keep in mind that the reason we are praising it is tied up in all of these really complicated and pernicious norms about whose bodies are worthy of care and attention, that sort of play into a lot of ableist and anti-fat norms. So we want to be really careful in how we like as a society respond to those decisions, just on the sort of basic level, and who we are giving praise to, who we're not. But in terms of like the health risk of all of that, I think it's also really important to keep in mind, like it's not just about the physical health risk in the moment of like the damage it might do to their cardiovascular system, for example, but also about what this sets up for their relationship to their body moving forward. Being put through a sort of really drastic diet regimen, often, and like particularly like a restrictive diet regimen where you are obsessively working out and drastically cutting back on what foods you can eat, has a really high risk of leading someone to have an eating disorder. And Hollywood is already rife with eating disorders. And we've seen this come up especially with like young actors. You look at like former child actors or teen actors who reflect back on their time in Hollywood. And it often starts with like getting fit for a role and then leads to a lifetime of substance abuse and of eating disorders and going in and out of rehab and mental health treatment because their relationship with their body has been destroyed due to the pressures they had to change their body for a role and the sort of intense scrutiny that they were under for both their acting and just their life as someone in the public eye. So I think we have to be really careful in thinking about what we're asking actors to undertake and what we're letting them undertake. Like even if an actor is like, no, it's I'm down for this. I love the transformation of my body. It's really fun to like experiment with that. I think that the responsible artist has a duty to try to protect the actors that are involved in the artwork they're creating, and to maybe put a stop to that, to say like we're not going to let you undergo this drastic transformation because of the harms that we see in you as you're undergoing this. So I think like maybe a little bit of paternalism as a treat can be a good thing here to protect actors from making a choice that ultimately doesn't necessarily have that much payoff in the end, just to get another story about a super jacked hero.
Yeah, and I mean there's several things to say about that. One is, you know, Henry Cavill as Superman. He's an alien from another planet who has superpowers. Why does he have to be jacked, right? Like he doesn't
Yeah.
need to be jacked to fly. Why does he need to be jacked to like punch someone really hard, right? He's an alien with superpowers. Or so I mean that's one thing, and I think that's worth setting aside. It's just a thing to note and set aside. But one is, there's not merely the negative harms that like getting ripped or jacked or whatever your word you want to use has for the actor themselves, but also sort of the body image of viewers, right? That this is something inaccessible for the overwhelming number of people watching the film, right? That these people have 6 months to devote fully toward transforming their bodies where they have no other work to do. They don't have a 9 to 5 job to go to. They may have nannies to take care of their kids. They have a private chef or personal chef who can make all their meals for them. They can afford all of that. Um, but then further, and we talked about this before we started recording, right? That in order to get the shirtless shot of Chris Hemsworth or Benedict Cumberbatch as Doctor Strange or Paul Rudd as Ant-Man, right? That shirtless shot requires a 4-day regimen where they eat no carbohydrates, none, right? And they dehydrate themselves,
Yeah.
right? Where to the point where every actor who's described that is like, yeah, I was basically hallucinating and ready to pass out for the previous 2 days because they have had zero carbs and almost no water, right? And in order to get that shot, right, where basically they're thinning out their skin, um, right, to make them look as muscular as possible, right? Like that's entirely unattainable for anyone. And so it's like,
Yeah.
negative body image for, men presumably watching this in the audience that, oh, that's what I should look like, but that's not attainable to me. And it's not attainable because no one should ever do that.
Yeah. Yeah, and often they're doing this so that they can get whether, maybe the 2 second clip in the movie where audiences are oohing and ahhing because the actor took their shirt off for an unknown reason that's not really promoting the storyline anyway, or for like a poster promoting the movie. And in those moments, like the artist is choosing to trade off the dignity and well-being of their actor for money, to play into these sort of societal notions of what kinds of bodies are desirable, knowing they can profit off of that sort of decision. And that just doesn't seem like in any world a responsible trade-off to make, where you're asking someone to harm themselves to feed into or buy into this problematic system of like idealized body standards, just so that you can get like a hot picture of their six pack. Um, and, especially for theaters like Marvel, where they are some of the most financially like powerful institutions in the country, if you really needed that shot, like, setting aside the problematic beauty standards aspect of it, which I think is huge, why not just CGI it anyway? Like, why put the actor through that degree of suffering and harm for what is going to be like maybe 10 seconds of the shot or of the sort of end product? So I really think that like I hope we will get to a place where we see that's not really justifiable, just on like a personal health basis, let alone when we bring in this conversation about like normalizing these unattainable beauty standards, that has been shown to lead to like high rates of eating disorders in viewers. Um, so yeah, we have to be really sort of mindful of all of that. And I will say, just like on a sort of related note, that when artists choose to sort of lean into these attitudes about what bodies should look like, and particularly anti-fat messages, that there's some data that has come out that suggests this is going to increase anti-fat stigma in viewers. It's going to reproduce those attitudes in the audience. So, great that they got a funny joke about like Cheese Whiz and Chris Hemsworth in Avengers Endgame. But the worry is that helps exacerbate anti-fat attitudes in the audience as well. So I think we have to keep in mind what this is doing, not just to the actor themselves, but to the audience through reinforcing these sort of unattainable standards for the audience, and also through like helping reinforce problematic attitudes in the viewer.
Yeah, yeah. Awesome. So I think we'll end it there.
Right.
Cheryl, thank you so much. This was a really terrific conversation, and I really like your paper. I'm glad, as one of
Thanks.
the anonymous reviewers, that it was published.
Thanks so much. Yeah, appreciate the help and all the feedback on it. It's been great to talk about the project.
Awesome.
Awesome.